Why does it feel like the more effort you put in, the further they drift? You send the message, then wait. Your mind starts running through every word you wrote. You check your phone again and again, but there's nothing. So you try harder. You add more explanation. You show more affection. You give more of yourself, thinking it will finally bring them closer. But instead, they feel even more distant, harder to reach, colder in response. And at some point, you start wondering what is actually going on. Because in your mind, it feels personal. It feels like rejection, like you're being ignored, like you're not important enough. And that emotional pain pushes you into action. You think maybe if you block them, they'll realize your value. Maybe if you explain yourself one more time, they'll finally understand. Maybe if you show just how much you care, they'll come back closer. But every step you take is being driven by fear. Fear of losing them. Fear of being replaced. Fear of being forgotten. And when fear takes over, it creates a very specific pattern. It makes you rush. It makes you overreact. It makes you believe you need to fix everything immediately, or you'll lose the connection completely. So you act. You send longer messages. You ask for clarity. You push for answers. You try to tighten your grip, thinking that holding on harder will stop them from slipping away. But here's the part that hurts to accept. The more tightly you hold, the more they tend to pull back. Because you're not dealing with someone who responds to emotional pressure in the same way you do. You're dealing with someone who tends to withdraw from it. People with avoidant tendencies don't process closeness the same way. When emotions rise and things feel intense, they don't move closer for comfort. They move away to regain control. What feels like connection to you can feel like pressure to them. What feels like intimacy can feel like restriction. So when you block them, it doesn't always create the reaction you expect. When you beg, it doesn't bring them closer. When you chase, it doesn't spark pursuit. More often, it triggers their need for space even more strongly. And suddenly you find yourself stuck in a cycle. You reach out, they step back. You try again, they go quiet. You push harder, they disappear further. Each time it happens, it doesn't just affect the situation, it affects you. Something inside starts to wear down. You begin to question yourself. You start replaying everything you said and did. You wonder if you were too emotional, too intense, too needy, too much. But the reality is not that you are too much. It's that you're trying to create closeness in a way that feels natural to you, with someone who doesn't experience connection the same way. That mismatch creates confusion. You believe love should be shown, expressed, confirmed, and felt through closeness. But for someone with avoidant patterns, love often feels safer when there is space between them and the other person. So when you move closer, thinking you're building connection, they may feel something completely different: pressure, expectation, or loss of control. And control is something they unconsciously try to protect. That's why they withdraw. That's why they go quiet. That's why replies get delayed or energy feels inconsistent. It isn't always about lack of care. It's often about emotional overwhelm triggered by too much closeness too quickly. But here is where things usually start to fall apart. Instead of recognizing this pattern, you take the distance personally. You interpret it as rejection, as disinterest, as the end of the connection. And that interpretation creates reaction. Emotional reaction leads to more intensity, more urgency, more pursuit. And that's exactly what deepens the withdrawal. Because now it's no longer just closeness they are stepping away from, it's the pressure, the emotional weight, the expectation to respond or explain. What could have been a slow, natural connection turns into a cycle of overwhelm and retreat. Think about the pattern. Every time they step back, you step forward faster. Every time they go quiet, you become more expressive. Every time they create distance, you try to close it immediately. But what if that urgency is actually what's pushing them further away instead of bringing them closer? This is the part most people don't see clearly in the moment. You can't chase someone who is internally wired to pull away under pressure. You can't force clarity from someone who shuts down when emotions become too intense. And you can't create security in a space where emotional safety doesn't exist for both sides. The more energy you put into them, the less energy you have for yourself. Slowly, your attention shifts completely. You stop focusing on your own life and start focusing on their behavior, their replies, their tone, their distance, their silence. Your emotional state starts depending on their presence, and that's where things start to break down internally. Because now you are no longer grounded. You are reacting instead of choosing, waiting instead of living, hoping instead of standing steady. And that emotional dependency becomes visible in your energy even if you don't realize it. It creates urgency, it creates pressure, it creates intensity. And instead of bringing them closer, it reinforces their instinct to step back. Not because you are not enough, but because the dynamic has shifted into something that feels emotionally heavy on one side. Avoidant patterns are often highly sensitive to that kind of emotional weight. They can sense expectation without it being directly said. They can feel urgency without words. And instead of leaning in, they protect their space by stepping away. This is why the cycle repeats. You move closer, they move away. You try harder, they disconnect more. And each repetition makes the confusion deeper on your side. But once you recognize that this is a pattern, not a personal failure, something changes in how you see it. It stops being about saying more. It stops being about proving anything. It stops being about convincing someone of your worth. It becomes about understanding what actually creates connection and what quietly destroys it. Because without realizing it, the very reactions you're having are feeding the cycle that keeps pushing them away. And until that changes, the outcome doesn't change either. Not your effort, not your explanations, not your intentions. So before you reach out again, before you react emotionally, before you try to close the distance, you need to clearly see what pattern you're in. Because once you see it clearly, you won't be able to respond the same way again. And what makes all of this even more difficult is the silence itself. Because people who withdraw rarely give clear explanations. They don't usually say they feel overwhelmed. They don't explain that closeness triggers discomfort. They don't put into words the internal conflict they're experiencing. Instead, they become inconsistent. One day they seem present, the next they feel distant. They give short replies. They delay responses. They disappear without explanation. And that uncertainty is what keeps you mentally locked in. Because the mind struggles far more with unclear situations than with clear outcomes. When something hurts but is clear, you can process it. But when something is unclear, your mind keeps searching for meaning. It replays conversations. It analyzes tone. It builds scenarios. It asks itself what went wrong. And that is where emotional attachment deepens, not because of clarity, but because of confusion. Not always from love, but sometimes from a lack of closure. And this is where avoidant dynamics become especially painful for people who feel deeply. Because your heart is looking for honesty, your mind is looking for certainty, and their pattern gives you neither. So you end up chasing answers instead of connection. The problem is, clarity cannot be forced out of someone who avoids their own emotional world. That person might care about you. They might think about you. They might even miss you in their own way. But if they haven't learned how to stay present with emotional discomfort, then real feelings automatically become something they try to escape. That's why their behavior can feel so contradictory. One moment they seem open, and the next they pull away. One moment they let you in, and the next they act like nothing ever happened. From your side, it feels inconsistent and confusing. From their side, it often feels like self-protection. Because for an avoidant nervous system, intimacy can get interpreted as pressure. Emotional depth can feel like demand. Closeness can start to feel like something that threatens their independence. So when feelings become too real, the reaction is often immediate and automatic. They pull back, they detach, they shut down emotionally. And if you don't understand that internal pattern, you'll keep misreading the situation. You'll assume distance means you need to try harder. But in many cases, the harder you push, the more unsafe the dynamic feels to them. Not because your love is wrong, but because their system was never taught how to hold steady closeness without feeling overwhelmed by it. Many avoidant people carry early emotional conditioning that taught them a painful lesson. Needing others leads to disappointment or instability. Maybe they had to grow up too fast emotionally. Maybe vulnerability wasn't met with safety. Maybe emotional needs were ignored or dismissed. Over time, they built an internal rule. Don't rely too much, don't reveal too much, don't attach too deeply. So even when they meet someone who is genuinely kind or emotionally available, that old survival system is still active. One part of them wants closeness, while another part becomes alarmed by it. That inner conflict is what produces the hot and cold behavior that leaves you confused and drained. To them, it doesn't feel like mixed signals. It feels like regulation. To you, it feels like emotional instability. And in that conflict, fear usually wins over desire. Not because they don't care, but because fear has more control in someone who hasn't healed that pattern yet. This is why proving yourself rarely changes anything. It creates the belief that if you just love more, explain more, wait longer, or stay more patient, they will eventually feel safe enough to choose you fully. But emotional availability doesn't grow just because someone else is trying harder. A person can be deeply cared for and still not have the capacity to stay emotionally present. And that's one of the hardest truths to sit with, because effort feels meaningful, sacrifice feels loyal, waiting feels committed. But loyalty without self-respect slowly turns into self-abandonment. Most people don't notice it happening right away. They just start feeling different over time. Sleep gets worse, focus fades, mood starts rising and falling based on messages. Peace becomes dependent on someone else's consistency, and what once felt like love slowly turns into emotional dependency. At that point, you're no longer in a calm connection. You're in a reactive loop. One message brings relief, one delay creates anxiety, one cold reply triggers overthinking, one small sign pulls you back in again. It can feel like intensity or passion, but often it's anxiety disguised as attachment. Because real connection doesn't keep you in constant uncertainty. It doesn't make you feel like you have to earn basic emotional presence. It doesn't punish you for wanting clarity or honesty. And this is where your power begins to come back. When you stop romanticizing what is actually destabilizing you. If someone only feels okay when there is distance, then your closeness is not the problem. Their unprocessed fear is. That distinction matters, because once you see it clearly, you stop turning their behavior into a reflection of your worth. You stop thinking, I wasn't enough, and start recognizing they weren't emotionally equipped for this level of connection. That shift protects your sanity, because the deepest damage in these dynamics doesn't come from someone pulling away. It comes from the meaning you start assigning to yourself while it's happening. Slowly, without noticing, you begin shrinking. You question your emotions. You soften your truth. You start editing yourself to feel easier to handle, less expressive, less honest, less you. All to avoid triggering distance again. And that's where people lose themselves, not in one moment, but gradually, in small compromises they didn't fully see at the time. Until one day, you realize you've been trying so hard to keep someone comfortable that you've stopped recognizing your own emotional voice. And that should never be the price of connection. You shouldn't have to disappear to be chosen. You shouldn't have to become smaller just to be kept around. If someone can only stay when you ask for nothing, feel less, and expect less, then what they're offering isn't real partnership. It's emotional convenience. And you were never meant for that kind of survival-based connection. You were meant for something steadier, mutual, and emotionally safe. But that starts with breaking the illusion that their distance is something you need to win over. Because the moment you start treating avoidance like a problem you have to solve, you slowly give away your power. Your mind gets pulled into strategy, timing, analysis, and overthinking every possible move. What to say, when to say it, how not to mess it up. And without noticing, your entire emotional world starts orbiting someone who is not even offering you consistency in return. That is a heavy cost for your peace. The truth is, you don't need more effort in this stage. You need emotional discipline. You need the ability to stop participating in a pattern that keeps draining you. Because the solution is not hidden in another explanation, another message, or one perfectly written emotional appeal. The shift happens when you stop responding the way you used to. And that change begins the moment you stop trying to control what happens next. Real power in this kind of situation is not about making someone come back. It is about not losing yourself while they are pulling away. Most people misunderstand strength here. They think it is about saying the right thing, finding the perfect words, or sending the final message that finally makes everything clear. But that belief is exactly what keeps them stuck, because it still places their emotional stability in someone else's hands. It still waits for validation before self-respect. It still depends on a response before peace. And that is where everything has to shift. The strongest move is not louder emotion, it is restraint. It is the moment you feel the urge to chase and you don't. It is when your mind starts creating panic and you don't act on it. It is when your emotions want reaction, but your self-respect chooses stillness instead. That stillness is not weakness, it is control. Most people struggle with this because they are used to relieving discomfort through action. They text, they check, they reach out. They try to fix the silence quickly because silence feels unbearable. But emotional growth starts when you stop using action as an escape from discomfort. That is emotional discipline. Not detachment, not coldness, not manipulation. Just the decision to stop sacrificing your inner peace every time someone else withdraws. And when you do that consistently, something shifts internally. Your nervous system starts to settle. The urgency decreases. The emotional spikes soften. You stop making someone else's inconsistency the center of your mental space. That alone changes everything. Because when you stop reacting, you stop feeding the cycle. And unpredictable emotional chasing is exactly what many avoidance patterns are used to. They are accustomed to pursuit. They are used to messages, explanations, emotional pressure, and attempts to close the distance quickly. So when that reaction stops, it creates something unfamiliar. Not pressure, not intensity, just absence. And that absence is where clarity begins to form. Not because silence is a tactic, but because it removes distortion. It strips away emotional noise. It removes the constant push-pull dynamic that kept both people locked in reaction instead of reflection. Now there is space, and in that space, something shifts. Not necessarily in them immediately, but in you first. Because you are no longer outsourcing your emotional stability to someone else's behavior. That is where your center returns. And when your center returns, everything about your presence changes. You become calmer, less reactive, less available to emotional chaos. And that kind of grounded energy is very different from anxious pursuit. Not because it is trying to create an effect, but because it is no longer trying to chase anything. There is a clear difference between playing games and standing in self-respect. One is manipulation, the other is alignment. One is driven by ego, the other is driven by stability. And that difference is felt, even if it is never spoken about. When your attention is no longer chasing, when your emotional energy is no longer reactive, when your focus is no longer centered on their inconsistency, the dynamic changes naturally, not through effort, but through contrast. Because people often do not fully register someone's value when that person is constantly proving it. But they do notice when that proving stops. Not because you became distant for effect, but because you became grounded for yourself. And grounded energy is rare. It communicates safety without words. It removes emotional pressure. It reduces urgency. And for someone who struggles with emotional overwhelm, that change can feel very different from what they are used to. Not as manipulation, but as clarity. And this is where many people misunderstand what actually happens. It is not about forcing curiosity or triggering reaction. It is about removing the emotional noise that was keeping everything unstable in the first place. Because once you are no longer reacting, the pattern loses its grip on you. And that is the real shift. Not getting them to understand you, not getting them to come back, not getting closure from them, but stepping out of the loop where you keep abandoning yourself just to maintain connection. Because every moment spent overanalyzing, waiting, or chasing is energy taken away from your own life. And when that energy comes back to you, your entire emotional state begins to stabilize. You start thinking clearer, feeling lighter, responding slower, observing instead of reacting. And that is what changes the dynamic more than anything else ever could. Not pressure, not pursuit, not emotional intensity, but your return to yourself. Now the dynamic is no longer shaped by fear. It is shaped by your boundaries. And boundaries are powerful precisely because they are quiet. They don't beg for understanding. They don't over-explain. They don't perform or chase approval. They simply hold one clear message: I will not abandon myself just to preserve this connection. That single internal decision can shift everything in your life, because from that point on, you are no longer trying to be chosen at any cost. You start becoming the kind of person who only remains where your peace can actually exist. That is a deeper form of self-worth. And when self-worth rises, desperation naturally fades. You stop reaching from emotional emptiness. You stop shrinking to gain approval. You stop confusing access to someone with real love. At that stage, if someone comes closer, it will no longer be because you chased them into awareness. It will be because your steady distance gave reality room to show itself. And reality always speaks louder than pressure ever will. Reality reveals what someone values. It reveals what they miss. It reveals the difference between emotional chaos and emotional maturity. That is why stepping back is not a passive move. It is an active form of self-protection. It takes patience, it takes restraint, it takes the strength to let truth unfold without forcing it. And not everyone can do that. Most people prefer forcing answers over sitting with uncertainty. But transformation begins the moment you can stay in uncertainty without turning it into self-betrayal. That is where control returns. And once control returns, the dynamic stops controlling you. From there, everything becomes clearer. Because you are no longer reacting to behavior, you are observing it. And there is a major difference between the two. When you are reactive, every small change feels like meaning. Every delay feels heavy. Every silence feels personal. Your emotions rise and fall depending on how someone else behaves. But when you shift into observation, something important changes. You start seeing patterns instead of being consumed by them. You notice consistency and inconsistency without spiraling into them. You stop asking how to fix it and start asking whether it is even right for you. That question is powerful because it moves your attention away from winning someone back and toward protecting your own peace. And that is where clarity begins. If they return, you will no longer interpret it as victory or validation. You will see it as information. You will pay attention to how they return, not just that they returned. You will notice whether anything has actually changed or whether the same cycle is quietly restarting. And this time, hope will not be driving your perception. Awareness will. Because once you step out of emotional chaos, you begin to recognize it immediately when it tries to re-enter your life. You will feel it in subtle ways: the tension, the hesitation, the familiar anxiety you once ignored just to keep things going. Those signals are not weakness, they are clarity. They are showing you what your mind used to rationalize away. And that is how you protect yourself without becoming cold. You stay open, but not unguarded. Kind, but not self-sacrificing. Present, but not attached to an outcome. That balance changes everything. Now, if someone reaches out, you are no longer seeking their attention as proof of worth. You are evaluating their presence. You are no longer asking, do they want me? You are asking, is this actually aligned with me? That shift alone can save you from years of emotional confusion. Because the goal was never to force someone to choose you. The goal was to learn how to choose what is healthy for you. And once you begin living from that place, your standards rise naturally. You stop accepting inconsistency as normal. You stop calling distance love. You stop tolerating confusion as something you must adjust to. Because you've experienced what it feels like to be grounded in yourself. And once you do, you can clearly feel what disrupts that peace. At that point, only two paths remain. Either the person begins to show up with more consistency, more clarity, more effort, not perfection, but intention, or they remain exactly as they were. If they move closer in a real way, you'll feel it. There will be steadiness, presence, mutual effort, no guessing, no decoding, no emotional chasing. Just a connection that meets you halfway instead of pulling you into uncertainty. But if nothing changes, if the same distance remains, the same inconsistency continues, the same confusion repeats, then clarity replaces confusion. You are no longer asking why they are this way. You are simply accepting what is already being shown, because by then you already understand enough. And from that place, nothing external defines your stability anymore. Not silence, not distance, not rejection. Your sense of self stands on its own, steady, grounded, unshaken. And from there, everything you allow into your life becomes a choice, not a need.